Welcome to Book Talk. There are a few more damning terms in the British political lexicon than appeasement, the 1930s policy of seeking to placate aggressive dictators like Hitler and Mussolini by offering them concessions. It ended not in peace in their time, but in World War. And in a new book, my guest today, the historian Tim Bouverie, looks at how and why that policy was pursued by the British government in the 30s and at the cocktail of cynical realpolitik, pacifism and complacency, perhaps spiced with just a dash of anti-Semitism that fed it. His book is Appeasing Hitler, Chamberlain, Churchill and the Road to War. So Tim, let's start with the background, because when you're talking about the 1930s, of course, the memories of the First World War, the wounds from it indeed, would still have been very raw.
Incredibly raw, and every year people gathered in far greater numbers than they do now, just members of the public at war memorials across the country, and there was hardly a person in Britain who hadn't lost a child or a husband or a fiancé or a friend. And so I think we have to be very careful not to judge the appeasers too harshly, because this was a traumatic experience the like of which the country had never suffered before, and the desire to avoid a second bloodbath only 20 years after the first one is a very legitimate desire.
I mean, you take as an example Anthony Eden, then, as a rising young Conservative politician, even then specialising in foreign policy, who had himself served in the First World War, and all of the relatives, almost all of the male relatives he'd grown up with, were either killed, wounded or imprisoned.
Yes, and it's interesting that Anthony Eden was then an opponent of appeasement. In fact, it's been pointed out by a historian that an awful lot of the most famous anti-appeasers, including Eden and Churchill and Alfred Duff Cooper, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time of the Munich Agreement, all of these people had extremely distinguished war records. It wasn't the case that people who had gone off and fought in the war came back and said, we must never have anything to do with this again, whereas Chamberlain, Halifax, Samuel Hoare and Sir John Simon, none of them had actually seen frontline action. Some of them had served in uniform, but they'd always been behind the trenches. So the war has a strange effect on parliamentarians, in that some of the people who had the most gallant records in the First World War were the most keen to stand up to Hitler in the late 30s.
And one of the most interesting things about the events around the rise of Adolf Hitler was how it was viewed from afar in this country. How people, some people seem to grasp almost immediately that this was something new and very, very dangerous. And others thought, oh, this is actually rather fine, you know, torchlit parades, exciting sense of national energy, flashing-eyed, dynamic, charismatic leader.
Yes, I think there are different reasons for that. The main reason why the upper classes were so sympathetic in some ways towards Nazi Germany was their profound fear of communism. The only thing more dangerous than your country potentially being invaded is having your land and money taken away, and having a massive fascist bloc with Italy and Germany in the centre of Europe to protect against communist Russia was something that they thought was quite necessary. And there was a huge amount of admiration for the fact that Hitler seemed to have found a miracle cure for unemployment. In this country, the national government was struggling to cut the huge dole queues which had been caused by the Great Depression. But in Germany, Hitler managed to slash it within 2 years by half, and then eradicate it within 4. What not enough people, apart from Churchill and others, realised is that he had done this by putting the German people to work in arms manufacturing businesses, which was obviously a great danger to this country.
Because at the time, I mean, to get the context here, Germany, after the First World War, was a country that had been required to admit war guilt, that it was solely responsible for the outbreak of the First World War, had very, very strict limitations, supposedly at least, on the armed forces it was allowed to possess, had a demilitarised zone across its major industrial region, the Rhineland, and all sorts of other territorial kind of encroachments. And Hitler was in the process of trying to throw these off, even though he had to move quite carefully at first. And the extent to which some people in Britain thought, well, this is actually quite understandable. We've humiliated them and now they're chafing against it.
Yeah, the British overwhelmingly seem to regret the Treaty of Versailles. John Maynard Keynes, who wrote his book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. I don't think there's ever been a book which has had a more boring title but had a greater impact. This was a huge bestseller, and it castigated the peacemakers for what Keynes described as a Carthaginian peace. And so there was a huge sense in Britain that the French and the British were somehow responsible for the Nazis. If only we had readjusted the Treaty of Versailles in the 20s, then this aggressive strain of German nationalism might never have arisen. But we didn't do that, and now it's too late. But maybe it's not too late, some people thought. And an awful lot of people, not just from conservative opinion, but from liberal and even Labour opinion, thought as well, if only we adjusted the Treaty of Versailles once Hitler had come to power, gave him a few colonies, allowed him a military, formed some sort of agreement about Eastern Europe, then he might just calm down and there would be no conflict.
On the other hand, there were people who picked up copies of Mein Kampf, read it from cover to cover and thought, ooh.
Yeah, I mean, the weird thing about Mein Kampf is not very many people read it. As a historian, I know the difficulties of copyright, and Hitler, owning the copyright of Mein Kampf, was able to ban foreign translations of this book for the obvious reason that it really was a murder note written before a murder was committed. The steps he set out in Mein Kampf were fairly closely followed by him in the 30s. And so when a translation did eventually come out in 1933 in America, it was a third the length of the original. All of the incendiary bits about needing to annihilate France and take over Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe and Russia had been cut. But the few people who did manage to read it, which included Britain's first ambassador to Nazi Germany, Sir Horace Rumbold, realised that this man and his plans were a serious danger to the peace of Europe and argued for remedial action.
But perhaps blissfully unaware of what Hitler had in mind, there were all sorts of exercises in, as it were, amateur diplomacy to try and build Anglo-German understanding. It seemed to involve, in many cases, a lot of aristocrats.
It is completely astonishing. I can't think of another period which is like this, where random, although highly born, members of the British aristocracy and society went out to Germany to have private talks with leading members of the regime and even Hitler. I mean, whatever you think of the Brexit process now, at least it's been conducted between the British government and the European Union. You haven't had the Duke of so-and-so going out and having separate talks with Donald Tusk and Emmanuel Macron. But aristocrats went out because they admired Nazi Germany, but also they were human beings who were hugely flattered by the attention that the Nazis paid on them. I think the Nazis, and in particular Hitler, had a great admiration for the British, a great admiration for the empire that they had built, some strange idea that we were somehow blood cousins, we're both of Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon descent, and so they really wanted to have, if they could, an Anglo-German alliance. And an awful lot of these aristocrats who had a profound fear of communism found a very warm reception out there and kept on going, to the complete despair of the British ambassadors out there who said, can we please do something to stop this? One of them wrote, is there anything we could do to stop the whole of Mayfair heading Hitlerwards?
But there's one of the things in the book is that you actually have, for the first time, taken a look at the archives. Was it the Duke of Buckingham who was one of Hitler's regular visitors?
Well, I don't know that the Duke of Buckingham ever met Hitler, but the Duke of Buckingham was not just Britain's, but Europe's largest landowner. He didn't have just one stately home, he had four. And he visited Germany every year between 1933 and 1939. He had an incredibly gallant war record. And the nicest way of putting it is he just wasn't very bright. He wasn't a Nazi sympathiser, but he genuinely believed that just by showing up and as many English people going out there and making friends with the Germans, there would be a way of avoiding a future war, which he thought would be not just disastrous for Europe, but completely catastrophic for the ruling elite within Britain, at least the economic ruling elite. I think the aristocrats didn't really believe that they had survived the First World War. They couldn't quite believe that the system had survived this destruction. They were pretty unsure that it would survive a second war and thought that there would probably be a social revolution, which in some ways happened with the Attlee government. And
on the other side of the coin, the Nazis thought that these people had more influence in Britain than by any means they had.
Yeah, the Nazis had a completely misconception about how the British political system worked. They thought, and this is a huge problem that the amateur diplomats reinforced, is that they thought that diplomacy was, and British foreign policy, organised in country house drawing rooms rather than in the Foreign Office and Downing Street. And when the abdication happened, Hitler refused to believe that it had anything to do with Wallace Simpson at all. Edward VIII, the Prince of Wales, had made a number of very pro-German, even pro-Nazi remarks, and these had been fed back to Hitler by his ambassador here, who later became his foreign minister, von Ribbentrop. And when the abdication happened, he wrote to von Ribbentrop and said, "You could come home now. There's no need to continue having a diplomatic relationship with the British. They don't want to be friends with us. They've just deposed a pro-German king." And he really wouldn't believe that it was anything to do with Edward's love for Wallis Simpson.
And while all this was going on, as you chart, there's a rising alarm in British political circles, at least some, about the pace of German rearmament. There's a lovely story in there about someone going to an air show and that, oh, this is the post office plane that you've got. Yes, that's our new fighter.
The Germans were completely shameless in their rearmament. They didn't try to hide it at all. As you say, British tourists were invited to witness displays of new German aeroplanes.
With only the thinnest civilian justification for them.
Indeed, and Hermann Goering in 1934, the head of the Luftwaffe, which at that stage was still illegal and technically a secret, wrote to the British government asking if he could buy some aeroplanes for them for police purposes, he said. And the British cabinet weren't in doubt about this. They were frankly fairly cynical. Ramsay MacDonald, who was Prime Minister and been architect of this massive global disarmament plan, which had started off in a conference in Geneva in 1932, approved a plan to sell British aero engines to the Germans, and they knew they were going to be used for commercial planes. Not just commercial planes. They knew they were going to be used for German fighter planes, and their rationale was, well, if we don't sell them to the Germans, someone else will.
And while the rearmament was going on, also the persecution of the German Jewish population was becoming more and more obvious. But what was the impact in Britain when the news began to leak out? Because there were certainly some people who really weren't that bothered and even approved.
Well, it's a very complicated and very sensitive and actually worryingly topical subject, anti-Semitism in the 1930s. On the one hand, there was a very prevalent stream of what could be described as casual or snobbish anti-Semitism within the British elite and other sections of society. But it's also not true to say that the British weren't shocked by the Nazi persecution of the Jews. The first nationwide act against the Jews occurred in April 1933, just 2 months after Hitler came to power, and 40,000 people demonstrated in Hyde Park, and there were other rallies in Manchester, Leeds and Glasgow. And even the people who were, of their own admission, fairly anti-Semitic in that they made jokes which we would consider completely unacceptable and disgusting today and were pro-German, like Lord Londonderry, would write and say, "I cannot understand what this German obsession is with trying to exterminate the Jews. I'm not a great fan of the Jews, but why are they so obsessed with it?" The big problem here is that it's turning world opinion against them. And consistently it was cited that one of the reasons there could never be an Anglo-German friendship was this persecution of the Jews. So yes, anti-Semitism existed in Britain in the 1930s, but it was a very different strain to anti-Semitism as it existed in Nazi Germany.
And of course, when things began to take an international dimension, first Hitler successfully took over Austria, then he started making territorial demands against Czechoslovakia, and then we had a word that became absolutely synonymous, really, with ignominious national surrender, the Munich Agreement, which I suppose was the highest expression of this idea that you just keep giving the dictators what they want and eventually they'll shut up.
Yeah, the Munich Agreement has become a totem pole for everything that is bad about foreign policy. Not necessarily always justly, and I think politicians have often taken the wrong lessons from the Munich Agreement. There were a series of attempts to understand what Hitler was trying to do and whether or not this was just an issue surrounding 3 million Germans, ethnic Germans in the fringes of Czechoslovakia, or whether this was part of a grand plan to establish German dominance in Europe. And Chamberlain came down on the side of saying that this was a limited programme that the Führer had, and it was frankly not worth a world war to stop him. And in that, he was deceived. And I think it's a major lesson for politicians today that you can't believe that your own personal diplomacy can trump an ideology or a national interest as conceived by other leaders. Chamberlain believed that his own charm had somehow brought Hitler back from the brink in his first and second meetings with the dictator, but in that he was just deluding himself.
Was this where opinion turned? Because people like Churchill have been being denounced as warmongers for warning about Germany for quite some time. Was this the moment when people started to think, hang on, maybe Winston's right?
It was. I mean, Churchill had a lot of ups and downs, often unconnected to Germany. His support for Edward VIII in the abdication crisis sent his stock crashing down again. But yes, by the time of September 1938, by the time of the Czech crisis, an awful lot of people were starting to say that Churchill should be brought back into the government, that he'd been right all the time. And it should be said that when the British did feel that they were on the cusp of war, they prepared fairly calmly for it. There was not, as the appeasers maintained, a panic and a sense that there would be a strike, as the Labour Party had argued in the early 30s. They wanted a general strike to prevent the country from ever having a war again if it looks like one was being threatened. So, but the real vindication of Churchill comes in March 1939, once Hitler has invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia and the Munich Agreement has been torn up and Hitler has been proven to be the liar which Churchill had always said he was.
But a final thought, really. One of the justifications that sometimes advance for appeasement is that Britain wasn't ready to fight, and that Chamberlain, by caving in the Munich Agreement, bought time for Britain to rearm and be able to defend itself against Hitler and the Luftwaffe in particular. Do you buy that?
I think that this is actually one of the biggest myths of the period. Yes, it's completely true that Britain was not particularly well equipped to fight a world war in 1938, but neither were the Germans. And nobody was making the argument at the time, least of all the appeasers, that we just needed to buy another year. Chamberlain thought at Munich that he was securing peace for our time. And he admitted later it was not to delay war, it was to prevent war. And in that sense, he obviously failed. And in the year between 1938 and 1939, the Germans actually out-armed the British and the French together. So this extra year argument doesn't really hold much water.
Well, Tim Bouverie, we all know how the story ended. It's been a fascinating account. And thanks for joining us. Appeasing Hitler is published by Bodley Head. And BOOKtalk will be back again soon. Do join us then.